I think this is a very important one too, because this gets lost sometimes. And I'll just wait to see. I could pick on Abhishek first. Abhishek, why don't you take this one first, and then we'll get it going.
Yeah, I think that's again not a very easy one, but we have some thoughts, some ideas that we've learned on the way, and I think it's also worth citing some resources and communities like Pistoia Alliance. They have been pushing out a lot of quantifiable metrics for different stages of how getting data fair. We learn a lot from that. I think for me and for Elucidata at large, there are 4 different values which we try to see how a company's or a data infrastructure is tracking. Right, one is just on the operational efficiency of the human experience. How easy is it to find the data that you have generated previously, or something that is in public domain? It's also important to look at into the connectivity of data, that how easy is it to interoperate from different tools. Do you have to do a lot of artisanal R scripting and Python coding to make that happen, or is it easy to do? All those things translate into better scientist experience. Any effort that we can do to reduce the friction there. I think along the way we have learned that some organizations, and some of them are on this call here, where they have built internal infrastructure where the data quality metric framework has been there, right, which is getting some adoption of what works and what not. I think AstraZeneca, they put something out on also at Pistoia, where the data quality was deemed to be inadequate, minimal, or comprehensive based on some metrics. But I think what we are missing as a community is also like something simple like FICO score, right? Which it's quite complex as to what makes a FICO score, but everyone kind of understands, everyone knows how to act on it. It has real consequence of will you get the next credit from your bank for car loan or house mortgage or not, right? Or even in closer to home, right? An impact factor of a journal, right? For better or worse, like we know how to interpret that and how to compute that. I don't think there's a simple enough metric accepted enough across the community. A critical threshold has not quite accepted it yet for fairness, right? There are a lot of efforts internal through some pre-competitive alliance like Pistoia. We have chimed in as well, but that is missing, and I think that will help a lot in going back to the previous thread of communicating to the C-suite. If there's an accepted FICO score, right, I bet that would help the conversation for sure, right? So yeah, again, happy to hear. Looking forward to hearing from other folks on the panel on the same question.
Go ahead, Andreas.
Yeah, I guess Abhishek, you really pointed out the nice resource that the Pistoia Alliance and the FAIR Toolkit initiative really put out there, and there are. And it's a great resource because they really go down to a detailed level, and I guess especially in, let's say, life science R&D or pharma R&D, this is really there. But I would even recommend just Google different levels of FAIR, right, or FAIR metrics. You will also find other metrics from other industries or other areas, right? So because this is not only a pharma topic. Now, if you walk through that, you will quickly realize that actually per letter, for findable, interoperable, you have different levels, right? How do you do that, right? And what I can share there here is what we have in a couple of systems at Roche is, well, it's more like a traffic light scheme, right? That you kind of break it down and visualize and say like, look, this data set, green lights. This is not, to the full extent of FAIR, right? But, you kind of make a threshold. Others are red, others are yellow, right? But this is, an imminent feedback to say like, okay, why? I want to learn more, and just make that a hyperlink and a clickable button, and to your internal FAIR data manifest or whatever, right? But that engages, the scientists, so the users, the end users, into that FAIR journey, and that comes back to the already mentioned topic of the cultural change in the mindset shift.
Great, that sounds awesome. Is that?
Andres, how did you surface, or how do you surface these traffic lights? I'm all for a FICO score type system. There's always an issue with surfacing intermediate metrics at the C level, but if done right, it can be quite powerful. So I'm very keen to hear how you surface the traffic light, how it's propagated, and what work you did around getting awareness of the traffic light system, Andreas.
Yeah, I can quickly respond. So this is of course not for the C-suite, right? But really for the end users, right? And of course, it's like an internal, hey, which metadata is there? Is that all right? Let's say are the right checkboxes clicked, then you kind of categorize it. However, to actually elevate that more on the C level, of course, we have data catalogs, and then you can see like, okay, how many data resources are on our cross-company catalog actually mentioned, and what is the level, in the traffic light scheme kind of in there, right? That helps, of course, already on the C-suite because you can put that on a one slider, right? Hey, what's going on there? On the other hand, and we are lucky that our former CEO, is even quoted, in our FAIR playbook, and says like, okay, hey, if we're not playing along, right, we basically waste time because we have to find the data again, right, or we have to measure the data again, and this is not, this is basically costing us money, and this is costing us time which we cannot spend for researching and serving the patient. Yeah, so I guess we have already the highest C-level buy-in that we can have at Roche.
That's critical because that's true transformation from the CEO all the way down to the new bench hire. So that was great to hear. Nick, I think you were next.
Yes, just building on the previous comments and bringing up the point about fair enough. And I think this relates to traffic lights, I think, are a great idea, but I think it's also true that you don't have to be green. You can be amber sometimes for understanding its use. And I think fair enough sort of sets the agenda around not necessarily having to go all the way for fairness, but you can still derive value during its sort of journey, really related to business value. So I think something to bring up and cover later as well.
Good point.
Okay.
Can I just
Richard,
go back and ask Andreas? The traffic light system sounds really good. Does that breed trust within the scientists when they're searching the result, the data set? They see a green traffic light and therefore they trust the data, therefore they don't repeat the experiment. Yeah, therefore they can take that as acceptable for them. How does it work? How does it translate to the scientist? Yeah, because this is sort of, that traffic light system is saying, hey, you've met the minimal criteria for FAIR, yeah, which the scientists may understand, it may not understand, but they say, hey, it's green, therefore I can trust that result, yeah, or that group of results.
Yeah, excellent point. And I would say, where it's kind of implemented, it's rather where we kind of in-source, external data, or right, kind of curate, because typically, it's easier. However, you touch on an important point, and I would say, that is, let's say, how can you close the circle between, a data producer and a data consumer, also for secondary use, basically, right? And, that is really, a huge gap, because typically either you can put the effort to make data fair on the data producer, or then, someone finds it, curates it, and, publishes it for secondary use, right? And here, there's the big question, and you said trust, right?
Yeah.
And this is, in my experience, what we have to fight again and again. That's the, my data, not our data, right? And that's the point. I only understand it, so why should I share it, right?
Yeah.
And the other one is indeed also, hey, okay, we did the experiment 3 years ago. Let's do it again, right? Because those guys might,
there's new techniques where we can do something else. We can change one parameter, therefore then it's going to give us a different result. Yeah, I've seen it before as well. And that's the reason why I say about trusting the data. Because as a scientist, I would come in and say, there you go, this is giving me a guideline, I'll repeat it just to make sure. Yeah. So you get 30 people doing the same experiment with the 30 negative results. They just don't trust the data because they didn't do it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Great feedback. Kate, you're up next.
Yeah, I love the traffic light system too. We've done something kind of similar at MoMA, where we really set out to understand like what are our primary data flows going from producer to consumer and how are they getting used. And I think one of the things that also helped us a lot was being able to have computational scientists pretty embedded into a lot of the program teams. And so as our scientists were producing and then using data and in team meetings talking about it and trying to use it again, we had a lot of people that just understood the data, that were able to quickly see what those data flows were and how they could be more efficient, and what really like our data was coming in, because we did find early on that asking a lot of our bench scientists and producers, like, what data do you get or create? They actually had a pretty hard time answering that question, but working with our computational team has been huge, because they really can help translate, and they're already so well trusted by the bench scientists that they've been able to help us create more objective metrics, I think, around, what are the most important workflows to have. And we have absolutely, like, I love the point that Nick made about fair enough. There are definitely workflows where we've said, like, they're fair enough. This is, it's not there. We have other priorities right now. So, I think having their help and really embedding them deeply into the program teams and project teams is a great way to get that information.
Okay.
Too.
I think what we're seeing too is scientific informatics is in its infancy, and some of these things that are coming out here, when we're able to start to annotate this data more and more to improve trust, to convince people why they should be using this data, we're getting there, right? It's coming out in this talk, but the annotation of the data and the future advanced contextualization is going to drive model quality data and higher order data use. John, I think you're next.
Yeah, I was going to change the focus of the question a little bit from metrics and benchmarks for the data or the processes that create the data itself, but more on the people. And we've heard in this conversation today about changing mindset and getting people to change how they work or think about data. One of the techniques that we tried to apply, and I think we had some success. Now, granted, it was in a fairly central organization, which was research IT, was to actually build it into goals and objectives. So setting out, here's what we're wanting from people's interaction with data and how you adopt FAIR principles, and then measuring that on the back end. So it becomes a normal course of conversation with the line manager. And then we can roll that up across the organization to say, where did we have strong kind of adoption and adherence, and where did we have weak adoption and adherence? And so they got to give us a snapshot of the org on kind of progress being made from one year to the next. When we started that, it was like, well, why would we add that to our goals? And by the third year, it was, oh, this makes a lot of sense, and it's just part of ways of working. And it was part of the adoption approach. For me, so I think this idea of laying out what do you want to see achieve and then measuring it in your goals and objectives process was an interesting measure and moved us pretty far along in terms of the people change.
I think that's a great lesson learned, and I'm sure there's others on here that have learned that lesson too. And sometimes it took years to get there, but it's actually very astute.
Yeah. Well, one of the analogies, sorry, John, before I jump from that point, one of the analogies that somebody used recently is that, it's just like in an organization, just like HR or, the management of human resource is part of everybody's job. Can you embed that same approach, mindset, data? Right. So just like you have line managers and people having to self-assess and set their own goals and objectives and assess how they did against them. If you imagine if you could embed, a similar mentality mindset for kind of how data is managed across the organization, just as if another human resource, right? So that's one way to think about it.
That sounds great. We use the term, if safety is a prerequisite in a lab, then data data management has to be as well, data involvement. So we're on the same level there. Mike Gillis, you were next. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the point that John had about getting back to people, and also something Abhishek mentioned at the very beginning of this question around the experience of people actually using the data. I think most people that work with data and think about it as most of their job tend to be fairly quantitative about how we think about things, which makes sense. But I think that there are actually some aspects of product management that it's a little bit more squishy maybe than we tend to think about, or at least I do, having more of a technical background. But the end product of applying all the FAIR data principles is a product, right? It is a thing that people are going to decide whether to incorporate into their scientific work. They're going to make decisions about, can I reuse this? Does it make sense to reuse this? Is this a good use of my time? Am I actually getting value from using this? So I think that there are actually aspects of, for example, the basic concept of the Net Promoter Score in product management is just like, would you actually suggest to somebody else that they use this, that they bother spending their time interfacing with this data and incorporating it into their work? And I think you can apply things like that to people in an organization and just say, like, what do you actually think about this? And I think that's something that I'm trying to talk to some of our clients about, trying to think of things in those terms, because it really does come back to, will a human make the decision to try and adopt this into their work? So I think that's really interesting.
Yep. Is that?
Yeah, Mike, brilliant. My question to John was going to be, how do you quantify or measure adoption? If we are going to talk about people and Net Promoter Scores, like there's lots of work around the voice of the customer. What about the voice of the employee, right? So those sorts of Net Promoter Scores or something like it are a great idea. Kind of answer the question I had for John.
Well, to start, even before you start to measure, is to benchmark. So as you change, people quickly forget that institutional knowledge disappears, etc. They forget where they came from, even 6 months after being in a high data wrangling environment. So if you don't benchmark and be able to prove 6 months, a year from your journey beginning, you will lose people right away. That has happened to us in the past. So benchmarking is critical. You start to see reduction in data wrangling. You start to see the way experiments are coming out of your ELN or your LIMS system, or the way your curated data is being used. You start to see those metrics, and it starts to ramp up very, very quickly when you take notice.
I'd like to add to that by saying that in multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, perhaps even transdisciplinary environments that FAIR is supposed to support, you have benchmarks. You've got to solve for data harmonization as well as benchmarks, so as to properly integrate tribal knowledge, not just to institutionalize it, but how do you harmonize the data coming from these different disciplines to enable transdisciplinary, if that's an aim at all. That might necessarily apply to all data research and development data environments. And I'm really struggling to find a tractable way of doing it with just humans. There has to be some sort of way of reverse polling ChatGTP to pull out an ontology for joining tribal knowledge in a tractable way. It's a non-trivial problem.
Yep. No, I totally agree. Abhishek, you had your hand up.
Yeah, no, I was just responding to that Mike and is it were referring to metrics. So one of the metrics that has been very revealing for us, and just for everyone's context, we have made public data fair and brought it to the market. A very surprising metric that we have used is how many times, and it's in hindsight, it's quite simple. How many times the same data set has been downloaded by a particular user, and it's shockingly revealing. We never thought that would be. We were always, interested in how much time do the users spend and logging sessions and so on and so forth. But it turns out that is a far more telling. And again, as I said, in hindsight, it makes a lot of sense. And it's in double digits in a few months, where the same data set, people come back, download it, and do whatever they have to do, which we don't have visibility because that's outside the platform. But the same data set is getting repeatedly downloaded.
Yeah.
So I don't know if a question back, right? Is that a metric, or is that an infrastructure that you internally use to see a data set that has been generated through a CRO or through your own labs? Like, is it getting reused? Is there a number that folks use?
I mean, I think so that use metric is totally spot on. I mean, I can't. I'm just trying to put it in other terms of experiences we have. When something works and it works well, it gets high use, right? And I think it's obvious. And the same as thing like Mike was talking about, systems, etc. If the system is optimized for the end users, it gets high use, right? It becomes of high value. And I think the same thing is true with data. And I think what we were talking about before with Andreas and others is that once that data starts to get more annotated and it drives the trust, etc., then again, the high use of that will be seen as well. I think, John, you have your hand up.
Sorry, I think it was a lingering hand, but I
Okay.
will jump in and say that that point about use and reuse and measuring it, using it as a metric, kind of leads you to some thinking, and I don't think it's been implemented. I'd be curious to know if others have seen it, where it's either gamification or a human reward system for the data producer who has created a high value, highly usable data, and is there some form of reward for that individual to help drive better behavior? I don't know if that's actually been implemented. It's been talked about.
I know companies have played with that. I don't think it's ever gotten wide adoption, as far as I know, around different larger pharmas and things like that. But I know, and I have colleagues that have tried to make that work. I think it's a good idea. I think it could be part of the adoption and the culture change approach, the change management.
The problem with that approach is you could have a piece of data which is absolutely 100% fair, but is actually not useful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, when you look at the metrics of the ones which have been downloaded, it's the one which is a nexus data point, which is saying this is a critical piece of data. It might not be the best. Back to Nick's point about fair, what's fair. Yeah. We're using it, but it's used a lot of times to do a lot more work. Yeah. So there's two ends of the spectrum there. I want to sort of lead this conversation more into the interoperability of the data and how we ensure that, because I think it was Izzat who raised the question about how do we join data sets together and use of ontologies. Now, I think that's going to be the critical point. How then we use those ontologies to leverage disparate data sets, which we have, to gain better insights. And ontologies is the way to go forward. But then how do we trust the data which we get when we create these augmented records? How do we trust the data? Because I've got experience where we've done this with our experimental record at GSK, 4 million records. To some degree it works, but it's not as straightforward.
No.
I'd like to hear the panelist viewpoint on that if we can.
I threw out ChatGTP, but it might not have the right training data for your data set, and then there goes trust. So large language models aren't impossible to train. But I think the emergence of more pointed large language models or medium language models going backwards a bit.
There's a lot of work to be done. I'm not saying there is not a lot of work to be done. I don't expect answers.
Yeah, I mean, Abhishek is probably one of the world's leaders in biodata curation and cleaning and all that. Without giving away the farm, Abhishek, is there anything there that you could comment on?
Yeah, I mean, is it our experience is quite consistent with this. There's hallucination, but if you retrain in a more vertically focused way, and we saw that in the last incarnation of LLMs as well, right, where BERT did not perform as well as PolyBERT. And again, it makes a lot of sense because BERT was trained on Wikipedia and we retrained PolyBERT on PubMed. And we're seeing something similar here with GPT, but it's quite impressive. It's much faster. You need a different kind of skill set. We have done some very limited pilots where we have not exposed that to our users because hallucination is a big concern that we have been very conservative about. But for our internal curators, that has been a huge advantage where the accuracy thresholds have definitely improved significantly over what PolyBERT was able to do.
Okay.
Very early days.
Early days, and it's going to be quite complicated because it is the ontologies which will drive a lot of that.
Yeah,
and if the ontologies aren't good enough,
yeah,
then you're just going to be churning out. I like the term hallucinations. I think that's a really good term for that. It's an hallucination. Yeah.
And we are using GPT on our clean data, so which is already linked to ontologies, and that is definitely helping.
Interesting. So
one of the very interesting.
It's so I like to call, I think what I like to call your position in the industry, Abhishek, like a second party data curator. The challenge with second party data is the SLAs with the first party data owners. So let's say you're a platform in the middle that you have the advantage of seeing lots of different data sets or ontologies from different companies, and you start to normalize and you're in a better position to improve accuracy or F-scores or however you want to measure accuracy there because you have more than one siloed set of data. The challenge is like of data ownership and who owns that second party data set. So if you have good participants in the data ecosystem, that's great. That really improves your centralized models or your global models. One of the challenges that we're trying to overcome in resilience is, being a CDMO or a next generation CDMO, like how do you federate these data sets in order to come about with an incredible second party data set that is an offensive data mission, like private set intersection is also not trivial, especially when there's so much at stake. The kinds of fortunes that can be made from the data generated from labs or these experiments are kind of the raison d'etre for some of these. So I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak French. Why am I speaking in French? It's the point of existence. Sorry, the Brits on the call will get it. Yeah, so it's an interesting position to be in, like being in the center of these. It's if you do it carefully, you could be onto something that will emerge and solve a big problem for the industry and the science overall.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Abhishek. Go ahead. Respond to that. Sorry.
I just want to thank you, and that's the hope. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of expertise. It's a lot of time, but that's the hope. That's what drives us.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a little bit. I have another question that we'll touch on it. Mike, you had your hand up, and then Tiffany.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment again about the ontology problem and trust and all of those things. I mean, something we're focusing on is, and maybe this is obvious or maybe it's impractical for some areas of larger enterprises that part of this is sort of their special sauce that they really need to keep more controlled. But process transparency, I think, and provenance seems to be such an important part of the trustability of data. And so if you can encourage people to whatever aspect of process and recording the details of process in a FAIR format itself, that seems to me at least encourage people to be able to look at the data and think about, well, how much of this is actually applicable to me? How much can I trust this because they've actually disclosed in a clear way the details of what they went through in order to get this in a way that I can actually incorporate and pull into my system and investigate and make a decision about as to whether or not that's actually practical to reuse.
Yeah.
What if the process is the intellectual property?
Well, yeah, that's a problem. Yes.
That's actually why why we call it FAIR data and process, because the process produces the data, and if you're not capturing the details around the process, you end up in that conundrum that you just brought up, Mike.
Yeah.
And it can be a conundrum because for different people, it may be applicable, and they may feel, or maybe it isn't applicable to them.
Sure, yeah, and I think you have to like look into ways where you can selectively disclose that, right? Like within your organization, you should be able to be completely transparent, I hope, and then provide selectively cut down views of that data externally to the organization if you're able to do that. But getting also into ontologies, I mean, it seems like there also needs to, as we have this concerted effort to make data more fair, the ontologies themselves have to be fair, right? Like we have to actually spend time on making sure that we're not duplicating ontologies, that we're finding the right ontologies and actually making an effort to make them known to people and say, like, we have to actually standardize on these things, because I know that there are places, I've heard at conferences and things, large, very well-funded enterprises that are going through massive ontology efforts internally. So they've got this broad proprietary ontology or series of ontologies that really cover them. And then if it comes to talking about reuse, or we're saying, oh, FAIR data is going to get us to the point where if we bring this other organization's data in-house and we're going to harmonize, it'll be much easier. It will be easier if like everything is fair and you've got your own proprietary ontology, but in two different places, but you're still going to have to go through another harmonization effort there just to harmonize the ontology. So
this
if
is
we're
going
not
to be
using
a topic
public ones,
this is going to be a topic of a future session, because it's a huge deal in the industry. And it's kind of it's like customizing software in a way where all of a sudden it's not the product anymore and you can't upgrade it, and now it becomes a technical debt, et cetera, et cetera. So we're definitely going to talk. This is a really important point that we'll have in a follow-up session alone, just talking about that. But it's a great point. I think Tiffany, you have your hand raised.
Yes. Well, of course, I want to feed off of Mike and talk about harmonizing ontologies for the next hour. I'm sure we all could. I'll just call out that there are now quite a few automated methods for harmonizing ontology. So potentially standardizing everybody to running on the same ontology isn't the solution there, because of how easily it is now to harmonize different ontologies. But I did want to bring the conversation back to assessing machine actionability and the interoperability of data sets, and the comment that is made on the ChatGPT potentially of ontologies. There are also automated and mechanistic ways for us to check that a data set is machine actionable, right? We can look at the data formats, we can look at the presence of metadata, we can see if there is semantic markup associated with the data, and even assess that the data itself is following a standard ontology, whether that's a globally accepted ontology or an internal ontology. While I haven't seen any research of it, I would assume that because we can mechanistically look at a data set and say, is this following a standard ontology, that we would then be able to do the reverse, look at a data set that maybe doesn't have an ontology associated with it already, and make a recommendation for which ontology potentially that data set most aligns with, and then even take the next step of actually applying that ontology to the data. I haven't actually seen that, but in theory, it would make sense that we could do that. If anybody has heard of it, I'd love to hear more. But if not, maybe a business venture or a Pistoia Alliance topic.
Okay. Awesome. Is that you want to
I
comment?
was going to ask you to name some example mechanisms, Tiffany, and you just you turn the question back over to the panel here. I was so anomaly detection and data quality adherence. This is all in an area of the emergence of data ops, like DevOps for data, that I think is a fantastic complement to FAIR, or at least to operating FAIR. And I like anomaly detection tools on metadata is certainly an emerging field, just as the next generation metadata catalogs are emerging. The tool called Great Expectations that works well on structured data and any anomalies on that. But and there are a lot of canned type templates for the expected data and lining up with SLAs. But those are two tools that I've come across that can be used for improving trust. Right?
All right. Any rebuttal on that, Tiffany? Okay, so let's go. We're going to spend 15 more minutes, I think, 10 to 15 minutes on this next question. And then we'll turn it over. There's questions coming from the audience, etc. So tangible and intangible returns, the panel has noticed that can be attributed to FAIR implementation.